Heritage and family, so good to see you this morning. And we have come down through the years because He is God. He is God. I ask you to pray with me and for me. I'm going to try to get through what I got here today. It's a passage in 2 Samuel chapter 21, the 15th through the 22nd verse. The New Living Translation is the one I selected. Second Samuel chapter 21. Once again, the Philistines were at war with Israel, and when David and his men were in the thick of battle, David became weak and exhausted. Ishbi-benob was a descendant of the giants. His bronze spearhead weighed more than 7 pounds, and he was armed with a new sword. He had cornered David and was about to kill him. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue and killed the Philistine. Then David's men declared, "You are not going out to battle with us again. Why risk snuffing out the light of Israel?" After this, there was another battle against the Philistines at Gath. As they fought, Sibbecai from Hushah killed Saph, another descendant of the giants. During another battle at Gath, Elkanah, son of Jair, from Bethlehem, killed the brother of Goliath of Gath. The handle of his spear was as thick as a weaver's beam. In another battle with the Philistines at Gath, they encountered a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, who was also a descendant of the giants. But when he defied and taunted Israel, he was killed by Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimea. These 4 Philistines were descendants of the giants of Gath, but David and his warriors killed them. Amen. This is my Bible, God's holy word. It is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. The grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word of our God shall stand forever. This is my Bible. This is my weapon, sword of the Spirit. Amen. I want to talk about this subject, the giants keep coming. The giants keep coming. Now, what began as Negro History Week in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson has been designated Black History Month in the United States by every president since 1976. But I recently discovered that Black History Month is also celebrated in the month of February in Ireland, in the Netherlands, and as well as in the UK in the month of October. In these nations, and perhaps some others mentioned this morning, the rich history and contributions of black people are remembered, recited, and reclaimed. And such observances serve as catalysts to foster ethnic pride among a people who have historically been castigated and depicted as an uncultivated and heathen race. However, these celebrations reveal and accentuate the truth about people of African descent whose lineage is replete with individuals and nations of people who made indelible marks on the pages of world history through and by their influences. As a child, all I learned about black people came from television, depicting them as brutish cannibals in the remote jungles of Africa, some buck-eyed, tap-dancing minstrel acts, and unkempt slaves in America who made no contributions to the advancement of the nation or the world. These were the literary and media depictions of black people, with the exceptions of Booker T. Washington and what we learned of what George Washington Carver did with a peanut. It was not until I was an adult that I had access and availability to the rich history of black people in America and all of their social, economic, political, and technological contributions that made America the leading and dominant power in the world. It was not until adulthood that I also recalled and reflected upon the obstacles, the giants that my parents and my grandparents had to face and overcome in a segregated Jim Crow South and a discriminating North. Those things were giants. They faced, like those in the text, threatened their very existence and sought to annihilate, decimate, obliterate them by any means necessary. Most of us can recall the story of David and Goliath. We learned it as children in Sunday school. When David was yet a shepherd boy, Israel and their arch enemy, the Philistines, were at war. Saul was king of Israel at the time, and David's older brothers were serving under Saul's command in the army. David's father, Jesse, sent him to the front line with some foodstuff for the officers in the army, as well as to check on the well-being of his brothers. When David arrived to the battlefield, he noticed the shock and awe that had sapped the fight out of the Israelite soldiers, who were demoralized and they were trembling in fear because of their enemy. And while he was trying to make an assessment of this situation, his attention was suddenly drawn to the ranks of the Philistine army that had encamped across the valley on the other hillside. His attention was drawn to a giant of a man who stepped out of the ranks of that army, a man named Goliath, who was spouting off a challenge that he would take on anyone from Israel, one-on-one, hand-to-hand, man-to-man. And his proposal was that the winner would take all and could forego a huge loss of life that would result from a fierce battle. And although being a young man and a shepherd, mind you, David took up the challenge. He killed Goliath, which gave Israel the victory according to the proposal. And David was celebrated as Israel's greatest warrior, and soon after he rose to serve as their most venerated king. And during David's reign, he was able to stabilize the region and No longer did they have to war with any of their enemies. However, there was an ongoing tension between these two nations, the Philistines and Israel, after the battle in which David killed Goliath. The Philistines never forgot, nor did they ever get over the fact that David killed their giant, killed their champion. And therefore, in their own time, they would resume their warring with Israel, a warring that was fueled by revenge and retribution. Israel's long and insistent enemy seemingly vowed that they would never live in peace with Israel until Goliath's death was avenged. David had escaped death by defeating Goliath, but now they had something else just as effective that would finally annihilate him. For in our text, war had resumed, and David finds himself on the battlefield again. However, this time King David is no longer that young warrior who had risen to the throne of Israel. Instead, he's an aged monarch whose mind was also willing to engage in battle. Nonetheless, his body had grown weak with years. And during the battle, David finds himself cornered, face to face, with a giant named Ishbi-benob, who many translations of Scripture describe as being the son of the giant, Goliath's son. Some scholars believe that all four of these giants were either sons and or relatives of Goliath. Ishbi-benob, the son of Goliath, was out to avenge his father. And all the translations say that he wore some new equipment. The son of the giant, full of revenge, full of vengeance, full of hatred, was not going to rest until David was finally destroyed. Fueled by hate. And this is the thing we have to understand about giants. They keep coming. They keep coming with new tools. They keep coming with new strategies. They keep coming with new weapons, all purpose to destroy you. Perhaps David thought that his giant fighting days were over after his defeat of Goliath. But here he is, at a time when he's most vulnerable, at a time when he is relaxed, perhaps a time when he has let his guard down. The giants keep coming. Our history records for us some giant killers. Giant killers who fought and defeated the Goliath that sought our demise and destruction. The Goliath that we face as a people was legalized chattel slavery. For this nation was built and became the economic powerhouse in the world because of the foundation laid by free labor. Tobacco was king in the East, cotton was king in the South, both of which were planted and harvested by slave labor. I recall one time old Newt Gingrich said about black people, he said that they didn't have a strong work ethic. And his word signals the sentiments of many of the privileged class. Either these folks are either oblivious to the truth of American history, or they conveniently choose to ignore the impact that slave labor had on the development of America's wealth. My contention is that that's selective ignorance, because history records record that in the 1860 census, there were 4 million slaves in America. And on a typical plantation, slaves worked from 10 to more hours a day. They would work from day clean to first dark. I had a friend of mine tell me his grandfather told him they used to work from can't see to can't see. At planting and harvesting time, they were required to stay in the fields 15 to 16 hours a day. And on large plantations, the masters relied on slave carpenters and bricklayers, blacksmiths, and tanners and tailors and butchers and coopers and masons and cabinet makers and metal workers. A large number of them worked as waiters and cooks and drivers and housemaids and weavers. And during the 1850s, 500,000 slaves lived in town. And they lived in cities where they worked in textile mills, as iron workers, in tobacco factories, in laundries, in shipyards. Other ones worked as lumberjacks, deckhands on riverboats. They worked in sawmill and grist mill where they made flour and grits, and they worked in quarries. Many of them engaged in the construction of railroads. The fact of the matter is that slave labor from Virginia and Maryland built the U.S. Capitol, including the White House. So whether forced labor or not, slaves had an unparalleled work ethic that lined the coffers of American capitalists. Slavery was our giant. It was our Goliath that was slain in 1865 by the 13th Amendment. However, just like in our text, Goliath had some sons. He had some relatives that vowed to avenge his death and again dominated and destroyed their perceived enemy. I'm talking about the giants keep coming. The abolition of slavery appeared to have ended the threat and horror of that reality. After the dissolution of slavery, there was a period of reprieve and inspired hope among the slaves that things were going to get better and that there would be peace and prosperity in the land now. The era of Reconstruction, it began. And during this time, blacks served in state and national political offices. They became landowners and farmers. The populist movement emerged during this time, gaining political strength, and it focused on giving power and economic parity to farmers in the South and in the West. Former slaves and whites united themselves, and they demanded that the businesses and the railroads pay their fair share of taxes, as well as give fair wages to laborers. However, white Democrats who were bent on the doctrine of white supremacy began their plan to sabotage this movement in order to continue their control of poor working class farmers and laborers. And wealthy businessmen who owned and controlled the media, they started a campaign to invoke fear among poor whites. They did so by demonizing blacks in print, depicting them as savage, hypersexed brutes who would defile the white race by raping their women and taking their jobs, and they characterized black women as promiscuous, even predatory Jezebels. They controlled the politicians. I ain't making none of this up. They controlled the politicians, and therefore they invoked laws of separation and gave birth to what was called Jim Crow. And although freed from the manacles of chattel slavery, black people in America faced another giant wearing some new equipment that was just as threatening. I said the giants keep coming. That giant denied women of their right to work and their right to vote, as well as prevented blacks from joining trade unions, even though they had gained all the skills and were willing to work. Segregation and discrimination polarized black people and confined them to substandard living conditions, education, and health care. And they did that in the North as well as in the South. Segregation did not exempt black professionals, for they too were restricted in their ability to live and move outside the prescribed boundaries and the social environments. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that racially segregated public facilities were legal so long as the facilities for blacks and whites were equal. The ruling constitutionally sanctioned laws barring blacks from sharing the same buses and schools and other public facilities as whites, and that law known as Jim Crow established the separate but equal doctrine that would stand for the next 6 or 7 decades. Taxation without representation was the burden that blacks had to carry as they were denied equal protection under the law, as well as being prohibited from enjoying the same benefits that white taxpayers enjoyed as they visited and frolicked in public spaces and institutions and parks and beaches. I said the giants keep coming. In 1951, after his daughter Linda Brown was denied entrance into Topeka's all-white elementary school, Oliver Brown filed a class action suit against the Board of Education of Topeka. In 1954, it looked like the giant had been slain in the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. This was a landmark Supreme Court case in which the justices ruled at that time, and they ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. Brown versus Board of Education was one of the cornerstones of the civil rights movement and helped establish the precedent that separate but equal education and other services were not, in fact, equal at all. It now appeared that the giants had been conquered. Slavery, Jim Crow, women's rights, voting rights, Plessy versus Ferguson, but nevertheless, the giants keep coming. And although the Philistines in our text had completely succumbed to the army of David, yet the appearance of any giant champion among them revived their courage and stirred them up, emboldening them to renew inroads into Hebrew territory. Our text says that 4 successive contests involving Goliath's sons or relatives they provoked during the latter period of David's reign. I think we're living in a time like Israel where these giants keep on coming. Because America would never admit that it's founded upon the doctrine of white supremacy. But its historical actions are likened unto the Philistines, who were determined to regain their dominance over Israel no matter how long it took. Never before in most of our lifetimes, yes, have we seen the giant of racism and white supremacy rear its ugly head and spew venom of racial hate like we've seen in the presidency of 46-1. Yet, lest we delude ourselves, this ideology of white supremacy and subjugation of blacks has always been present throughout American history. We saw its presence. I was a boy then, but I remember John F. Kennedy. You know, his approach to civil rights was lukewarm and non-committal. During his presidency, at the height of the civil rights movement, Democrats held a narrow margin of seats in Congress, and Southern Democrats opposed to civil rights legislation held some of those seats. So in an effort to appease the Southern political position of states' rights and hopefully to gain his re-election in 1964, Kennedy cautiously approached civil rights by emphasizing the enforcement of the existing laws as opposed to adopting new ones. However, it took the violence in Birmingham to alter his course. As the whole nation watched in horror, police using nightsticks and dogs and fire hoses against unarmed, defenseless protesters. I said the giants keep coming. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. President Lyndon Johnson signed this law into act on July 2nd, 1964, which prohibited discrimination in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities, and made employment discrimination illegal. And although Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law on July 2nd, he lamented his decision. And he was later quoted when he said, "We just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come."